To recap, in the first part, I introduced the concept of death mother and the Western perspective that sees any kind of hostility and ambivalence, let alone infanticide, as unnatural, as going against human biology. In parts 2 and 3, I talked about the anthropological perspective, showing how mothers have evolved a range of emotions and behaviours to fit and match the different environments in which they might find themselves when they're trying to raise children. In this, the fourth and final part, I'm going to explore how that knowledge, the knowledge that comes from evolution and from anthropology, how can it contribute to healing and to change? How does it make a difference to the emotional suffering that we experience in a modern world? Obviously, the evolution and the anthropology, what we've learnt from it, has implications for politics, for economics. But that isn't my area of expertise. My area of expertise is in personal change, in psychotherapy and in emotional healing. So that's what I'm going to focus on here. Knowledge, consciousness is not enough in and of itself to bring about change and healing. We have to go inside ourselves and feel what we carry from inside, and we have to be able to face it and then take steps to change. It's scary and it's challenging. Knowledge won't do that for us, but knowledge can help to hold us as we do that. It can help to give us a framework, can help to give us a container where we can steady ourselves as we go through that process. There's been a lot of work done on the neurobiology of mothering and of infants, and the parts of that work that have filtered through to psychotherapy have helped a lot of people, a lot of us hold ourselves as we go inside ourselves to explore what we carry. I'm going to argue here that the work from evolution, from anthropology, that the research that I've talked about in the middle two parts can make a parallel contribution. I'm going to start with, I think, the fact it can make a big difference to women who are struggling to love their children, to women who've had to let go of their children to adoption or for whatever reason. The way that we've idealised mothering in the West means that we see such women as abnormal and less than human. And actually, the women who've had to do this see themselves in that framework too. They take on that cultural belief, and that leads to what we call shame, this kind of abiding, visceral, insidious conviction of being fundamentally inadequate. Living with shame is intolerable. And there's an impetus then to get rid of whatever's causing shame. So, I'm fundamentally inadequate. I'm not a real human being. I'm less than human. Okay, well, if I can get rid of whatever's triggering that, then it'll be better. So if you're feeling that way because of how you're mothering, the impetus is going to be to want to get rid of the child. That's going to lead to more hostility, more ambivalence towards the child, and create a vicious spiral. Psychoanalyst Rositska Parker, who wrote a book called Mother Love, Mother Hate, interviewed a woman who just encapsulated these feelings. So I'm just going to read this woman's quotes. I can remember hurling the baby down on the pillow once and just screaming and not caring. I wanted to kill him, really. I think it was to do with being so tormented, worried and guilty. You know, the anxiety and guilt at feeling I was getting it all wrong and that I was bad and useless. I just wanted to get away from the situation. I felt unable to tolerate it. So when we idealise mums, any mum who isn't living that ideal is going to feel bad and useless and want to get away from the situation. And that's going to create hostility towards the child. This isn't just a kind of American Western phenomena. There were psychologists called Lou Marie Kruger and Marlene Lorenz who worked in a rural, semi-rural, low-income South African community. And women there had bought into the same beliefs about mothering. And those beliefs, and they were caught in the same shame-fueled spirals. I mean, these psychologists actually talk about these women experiencing shame. So they thought that a good mother was ever giving, ever providing, but they were in poverty and they couldn't get enough food for their kids. And so when their kids came complaining of hunger, it would hit the mother's shame and guilt. And women responded in a couple of ways. Some women were actually violent to their children, trying to just shut them up. And other women would sit there and say, I wish you'd never been born. We know that the long-term effects of that on children and on mothers are just, create incredible suffering. And so being caught in this idealized version of mother just creates these spirals. Additionally, when mothers are caught in shame, when anybody is caught in shame, we can't face ourselves. We don't want to look in and see that we're so inadequate. And at that point, you become alienated from yourself. And you're also going to become alienated from children if that's what's creating it, if that's what the trigger is for it. There can be no change and no healing when you're that alienated from yourself. All you're going to do is create continuing cycles of suffering. As Carl Jung famously said, we cannot change anything unless we accept it. Condemnation does not liberate, it oppresses. An evolutionary consciousness, an anthropological consciousness, given through psychoeducation, can get away from condemnation. It can allow us to accept, to find compassion. Maybe as a mother we're struggling with a young toddler and we've given birth to a newborn. Maybe we've got twins. Maybe we've got a child who's ill or a child who's disabled. Maybe we've fallen on tough times, maybe economically tough times, maybe the relationship's in difficulty, maybe our own health is bad, maybe we've lost support. Today, our children will survive, but in the past they wouldn't have done that, and our ambivalence and hostility is going to reflect that. And so if we can understand that we're following patterns that are hundreds of thousands of years old, patterns that allowed our ancestors to survive in these kind of circumstances, it helps mothers to change the context of how they see themselves. Instead of seeing themselves as defective, unnatural, not a real human being, they could start to see themselves as human. They're following these ancient human patterns. And once you start seeing yourself in that framework, you can let go of the belief of, I'm fundamentally inadequate. You can start to dismantle the shame. And that's not an excuse for staying on the path of death mother, for continuing to behave in this way towards your children. But it does open the door to creating compassion and to creating understanding. And that then allows you to look inwards and to honestly own your feelings and your behaviour. And that is what opens the door to change. There's a parallel dynamic that goes for those who've grown up under the shadow of a death mother. So we now know that if you grow up with a hostile mum, with a mum who's ambivalent or who's indifferent, it leads to trauma, sometimes called complex PTSD, sometimes called developmental trauma, sometimes called attachment trauma. There's a range of names. But we know that there's significant psychological and indeed physical embodied effects of growing up, knowing that you weren't wanted, that there's hostility. Clinicians are very aware of this. The general public is less so, because what's been focused on in the public sphere is much more overt sexual and physical abuse. So people who've grown up feeling that they weren't wanted don't see that as causing trauma. And then if they're behaving in ways or their feelings are out of control in certain ways, they don't see the kind of underlying traumatic roots of that. They believe that their behaviour must be due to their own inadequacy. I mean, they weren't physically or sexually abused, so there's no reason why they should be behaving this way. Must be that there's something fundamentally wrong with who I am. And that creates an own kind of silo of shame. And because the source is hidden, because you don't see the cause of that childhood trauma, you get imprisoned in this way of being, in this shame. You get imprisoned in what I call a trauma world, which is the subject of another talk that I've posted on here. An evolutionary consciousness can help us work our way out of this prison. For our ancestors, any hint of death mother, any hint of being a less favoured child, meant mortal danger. It was a concrete threat to survival for most of the time that human beings have existed. So there's a deeply embodied fear that children carry of that goes back generations and generations. Children have evolved to be incredibly sensitive to any sign of maternal ambivalence, let alone to hostility or possible infanticide. And when that fear gets triggered, a whole load of systems get triggered around that then create what we understand as trauma. You know, an infant can't know it's been born in the West in 2019 in a nice hospital and that the old patterns are no longer relevant. It can't know that child mortality is no longer 30 to 50%. Tiny infant has no way of knowing that, and so these old systems are going to be mobilised if you feel in any way unwanted. And once we start to understand that, again, it changes the context for somebody who's struggling with that, struggling with the after effects of that or the long-term effects of that. It can change the context in which we see ourselves. So we're behaving like this, not because of our inadequacy, but as a response to what throughout 99.99999% of human evolution would have actually meant death. And understanding that can alleviate shame, and it can open the door to self-acceptance, to self-compassion, and that's healing in and of itself, and it's also a vital step in opening the doors to change. So to conclude, a modern evolutionary understanding of mothering adds to the rich body of knowledge that we already have. It brings insight, it brings heart. It highlights the misconception of equating sensitive and committed mothering with natural mothering, and insensitive and hostile mothering with unnatural mothering. It takes the debate away from natural versus unnatural. It depathologizes it. It also tells us that we each carry within us an anciently embodied unconscious knowledge of how hard it was for ancestral mothers to raise surviving children, and that the dynamics of mothering have been far more precarious, nuanced and complex than popular culture would suggest. It also tells us, it also gives us a sense of how we all carry an anciently embodied unconscious knowledge of how precarious life was for human infants during our evolutionary history, and the profound fear that infants and children carry because of that. We're understandably reluctant to open to this knowledge. It triggers deeply embodied ancient terrors. Yet when we do open to it, when we allow it into our minds and into our bodies, we discover that an evolutionary consciousness frees us to understand our experience as an expression of our shared humanity, and not as a sign of some intrinsic and personal inadequacy of our own. So to conclude, listening to Death Mother's story and understanding the Death Mother feelings and behaviours as an aspect of our evolved humanity means that we stop seeing ourselves and other people through judgmental, dehumanising and shaming eyes. It allows us to bring compassion to others and self-compassion to ourselves. And that is healing in and of itself. That also frees us to go inside ourselves and to feel our way into what we carry in our own minds and our own bodies, and to face that and to open to that with honesty. And being able to face and open to what we carry in ourselves is what brings about lasting and meaningful change.